Eli Sagor at the Cloquet Forestry Center. We've got a small but dedicated, intrepid group here maintaining social distance, and excited to hear a good talk this afternoon from Mike Schrage. I want to thank all of you who have joined online. Sorry to those of you who had a problem connecting, and I expect that we'll have a few others signing in here in a few minutes. Also, if you're wondering why the lips are not moving on the person you're seeing in the video, that's because I'm not in the video. That's our speaker. You'll hear from Mike in just a minute. As always, because I know we have some new folks on this time, we are recording this presentation. We will make the recording available after today's talk. If you would like to get continuing education credits, then watch for a link that I'll share through the chat pod near the end of the hour. And it'll be important that you look for that link and enter your information within about a half hour or an hour of the end of the presentation. That's how we track continuing education credits. You cannot get credits, unfortunately, for watching the recording, only the live presentation. I should mention as well that this series is offered jointly by my organization, the University of Minnesota Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, and the University of Minnesota Extension Forestry team. Matt Russell is hosting a broadcast in St. Paul today, and is a big part of this program as well. With that, given the late start, I think we're going to go ahead and just get started. Our speaker today is Mike Schrage. Mike is a wildlife biologist with Fond du Lac Natural Resources. Really glad to have Mike here. Appreciate, Mike, you're making the mile trek down the road to join us. And Mike is going to be talking about a couple of different studies of ecological and social suitability or acceptability of elk reintroduction in Northeast Minnesota, a topic that I know is of great interest. So Mike, you're on.
All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about this topic, and appreciate all of you joining us. Omashkooz is the Ojibwe word for elk. The Fond du Lac Band sees elk restoration as returning a native species and preparing for the future, and a future that is likely to bring some kind of change in it.
Click anywhere in the
there we go. Okay. So I think we've stereotyped elk in this country as a Western Rocky Mountain animal. And indeed, that's where most of them are found today, in these dark gray areas in the Western states and the Rocky Mountains. But when the first Europeans arrived in North America, elk were found from northern Mexico up into northern Canada, and in most of the lower 48 states from the East Coast and the Appalachian Mountains all the way across to the Western United States and the West Coast. A little bit about elk biology for those of you who might be unfamiliar with elk. Elk are more sociable than deer and are often found in small herds. Eastern elk are not migratory, or haven't been yet, even if they originated from Western elk herds that do migrate. And likely that's because Eastern elk don't face the high altitude, cold and deep snow conditions that their Western brethren do. Once established, Eastern elk home ranges are usually small. For example, elk in the Clam Lake elk range in Wisconsin, their herds are averaging about 10 square miles. In Michigan, average for cow elk, about 23 square miles, and a little bit larger for bulls at 35 square miles. Breeding season for elk is mid-September to mid-October, so about a month earlier than white-tailed deer. At that time, bull elk gather and tend to harems. Elk calves are typically born about the end of May. Unlike white-tailed deer, where twinning and even triplets can be common, in elk it's very rare. One calf per cow is the norm. Elk diet is variable. Given the chance, they are particularly fond of grass, and they will focus on grass where and when it's available. However, in the absence of grass, they can make a living just fine on browsing leaves and twigs too. Wisconsin and Michigan, their experience with elk would indicate that large 0 to 10-year-old aspen cutovers are the key to providing good elk habitat. Conflicts with people. Across elk range, I think probably the leading conflict is related to agriculture. This can take the form of damage to fences. Elk don't always jump fences. Sometimes they have a nasty habit of running through them. Stored forage, hay bales is another big one. I'm told that elk can tell the difference of which are the high quality hay bales, and we'll focus on those if they have access to them. And crop damage, corn, soybean, things like that. Additional conflicts in places, vehicle collisions, I think particularly where large groups of elk are migrating across highway corridors, this can be an issue. And in some places, elk winter ranges or adjacent to national parks, elk getting into gardens and lawns and causing damage there can also be an issue. White-tailed deer, I get asked a lot, so how do elk and white-tailed deer interact? Competition between elk and whitetails for forage and space seems to be lacking. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky all have sizable elk herds for a long time now, and sizable white-tailed deer herds. And they're not reporting any conflicts between deer and elk that I've heard about. Anecdotally, you will get comments, people will plant a food plot, usually to grow a big white-tailed buck, and then a herd of cow elk shows up and grazes that food plot flat. Brainworm is something I get asked about a lot. Many of you are probably familiar with brainworm as it relates to moose in our state. Like moose, elk can get brainworm. It's normally carried by white-tailed deer and seems to have little effect on deer. Elk can certainly get it. They seem to get it at a much lower rate than moose do, whereas in our state, studies would indicate that 25% or more of adult moose mortality is related to brainworm. Studies in other eastern states where elk and white-tailed deer overlap would indicate it's much lower than that, say 10% or less of elk mortality is related to brainworm. What does elk habitat look like in the upper Midwest? And again, I would lean heavily on the experience of Wisconsin and Michigan for this. A strong aspen component, particularly young aspen, is the key to providing good elk habitat in the upper Midwest. There should be a component of openings or upland brush in elk habitat. Land managers try to encourage hard mass production in our area. That would primarily be red oak. Where this is feasible, elk like acorns, as do most other things. And provide a component of mixed conifer deciduous stands for the mix of cover and forage benefits that stands like that can provide. So historically, elk probably inhabited 2/3 to 3/4 of the state. Originally, I think they were widespread across the prairie and the prairie hardwood forest transition zone. They were likely most common in the prairie, and this is reflected in their Ojibwe name, Omashkooz or Omashkoozug, multiple elk, which translates as prairie moose, but certainly right up to the edge of the boreal forest. A gentleman in Wisconsin in 1954, he did kind of a neat thing. He went through all the museum and private collections and literature references looking for evidence of elk, and wherever he found historic evidence of elk, he put a dot on the map of Wisconsin, indicating that elk pretty much occupied the entire state of Wisconsin historically. Since this work was done in 1954, there's been an additional record of elk found in Douglas County up here in the Northwest, shed antler in a tributary of the Brule River. And then this elk skeleton was found in some lake sediments in southern Bayfield County. The red stars on this map are where Wisconsin has restored elk, up here in the north in the Clam Lake herd and down in the south here in Jackson County. Historically, elk, like a lot of our native wildlife across the country, were wiped out due to overhunting and later market hunting, feed the eastern cities and the lumber and mining camps. and then by conversion of the land from prairie and woods to farms and towns. So if we start in 1800, elk occupied most of the state. By 1890, there were still sightings of elk in Aiken and Itasca County. By 1900, elk were restricted to small populations northeast of Thief River Falls. And the last verified sighting of original native elk in Minnesota was in 1932 in the Northwest Angle. So why would we look at restoring elk populations? Because elk were native to eastern Minnesota. And for many people, myself included, trying to restore native populations of wildlife where and when we can is the right thing we should do. To diversify and restore our traditional wildlife heritage, I would argue that when it comes to our hoofed wildlife in Minnesota, we're a long ways from what we traditionally had in this state. We certainly have abundant white-tailed deer populations, and they are found in places in Minnesota where they were not found historically. But our caribou are gone, and they're probably never coming back. The only bison we have in the state are confined behind fences. Our moose herd is half or less of what it was 30 years ago. And our elk numbers are a tiny fraction of what they were historically. So I would argue we have a long ways to go to restoring our traditional wildlife heritage. To diversify ecosystems. Diverse ecosystems are more resilient to change. And I think the only constant in life is change is coming. And if we have diversified ecosystems, I think we're in better shape to meet those coming changes. And one of those changes, I think, is climate change. Elk are an animal that survive quite nicely from Arkansas to Alaska and from North Carolina to California. I don't know what climate change is going to look like in Minnesota in 50 or 100 years, but I think I can safely predict it's coming in some form. Elk will do just fine. I think some of our northern wildlife species may not. A number of other places in the East have gone down the road of restoring their elk populations. Pennsylvania was first out of the gate successfully in 1913. They now have 1,000 or so elk in central Pennsylvania. Minnesota has its own history with elk restorations starting in 1914, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Michigan was next, 1918. They're now managing a herd of 1,000 or so elk in lower peninsula of Michigan. Arkansas in 1981. Wisconsin did their first elk restoration in 1995 in the Clam Lake area. They liked it so much they did a second elk restoration beginning in 2015 in Jackson County. Kentucky is kind of the poster child for eastern elk success stories. Starting in 1997, Kentucky went big. They went to a number of western states and brought 1,500 elk back to eastern Kentucky. They turned them loose in an area with a lot of reclaimed coal mine lands. Conservatively now, Kentucky has somewhere between 10 and 11,000 elk spread across 13 counties in eastern Kentucky. And the true number may be quite a lot higher than that. Ontario put elk back in 4 different places in the province beginning in 1998. Mixed success, they've done well in some areas, less so in other areas. Tennessee in 2000. Great Smoky Mountain National Park brought elk back in 2001. They're now leaking out of the park and into surrounding areas in North Carolina. In fact, a few years ago, an elk from Great Smoky Park walked all the way down into South Carolina. That was the first time since 1760 that South Carolina had had a record of an elk. Missouri in 2011 began restoring their elk herd in the Ozarks in southern Missouri. Virginia in 2012, and West Virginia started putting elk back in 2016, and they still may be picking away at adding a few more animals in that effort. So what about Minnesota? In 1914, winter of 1914-15, the legislature directed the precursor to the DNR to go out to Yellowstone and Jackson Hole and ironically, in this day and age, also to an elk farm in Ramsey County, and collect a bunch of elk, and they put them behind a fence in Itasca State Park. In 1929, 8 of those elk were taken out of the park and put up here in Lake County, approximately here, I think, in the old Stony River Ranger District on the Superior National Forest. There were only 8 elk. Wolves and bears were still there, probably no shortage of hungry loggers and miners. That restoration effort in Lake County failed and those elk disappeared. In 1935, the remaining elk from Itasca Park were brought up here to the Red Lake Game Reserve. They were turned loose, drifted to the southwest, and established themselves in what we now call the Grigala elk herd. In the 1980s, elk began to move into northwest Minnesota, into the Kitson County area from Manitoba. Some of those elk still go back and forth across the border, and some of those elk are year-round residents now in Minnesota. Recent population estimates vary between 79 and 131 elk, partly depending on how many elk are on the Canadian side of the border or the US side of the border. Elk populations in northwest Minnesota, because of conflicts with agriculture, are deliberately kept small. The herd is very productive. We can produce calves and grow some monstrously big bull elk out there, but numbers are not allowed to increase very much. So historically, Minnesota had elk across 2/3, 3/4 of the state. Currently, they are confined to 2 small ranges in the far northwest corner of the state, and this Grigala elk herd is currently at about 20 animals. The Fond du Lac Band a few years ago proposed looking at the idea of bringing elk back to areas in or near their historic range in northeast Minnesota, in this area. So what should elk restoration areas look like? I think one important key is that there needs to be a high degree of acceptance by local governments, public, and landowners. Elk restoration is going to be very hard to do if you put them somewhere they aren't wanted. The Fond du Lac Band has been shepherding this process along from the very beginning. And from the band standpoint, we want to do elk in an area where someday tribal members would have access to elk in areas that are reserved under treaty hunting rights. So that would be in the band's 1837 or 1854 ceded territories. It should be in areas with large blocks of public land. For elk are a large mobile animal. They're easier to manage when they're on public land versus private land. And when they're on public land, they're accessible to tribal members and to you and me. It should be in an area dominated by forest with minimal agriculture. And I would say in particular areas with active timber harvest. Elk are not an old growth animal. They need young forest, particularly young aspen. And agriculture leads to conflict. So let's not put them in an area where agriculture is a dominant land use the way it is in northwest Minnesota. Again, back to the abundant young forest. Elk are really tied into young forest, young aspen. Needs to be an area where there's active timber management. So how do we start the process of restoring elk to northeast Minnesota? The Fond du Lac Band formed a partnership with the University of Minnesota and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. We initiated a feasibility study to determine 1, the level of public support for the idea, and 2, the amount of suitable habitat for elk. This was a 3-year research project led by the university. We received $300,000 from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund in 2016. In addition, the Fond du Lac Band and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation put in another $51,000. These final reports were completed last August. We focused on 3 areas to consider for possible elk restoration. In the north, centered on the Cloquet Valley State Forest. In the middle, an area centered on the Fond du Lac State Forest and the adjoining Fond du Lac Reservation. And in the south, the Nemadji State Forest. Assessing public attitudes, the first part of our feasibility study, again, led by the university, asking basically the public and landowners about their attitudes towards elk and elk restoration. We sent out 8,500 mail surveys to randomly selected landowners and local residents in 2018. 4,500 of those went to private landowners, landowner being defined as owning 10 or more acres. 1,500 to landowners in or within 5 miles of each of our 3 study areas. We also surveyed 4,000 local residents, 1,000 each to the Duluth metro area, Carlton County, Northern Pine County, and Southern St. Louis counties. Our response rate, 60% for landowners and 46% for local residents. I'm not terribly experienced with these kinds of public opinion surveys, but I'm given to understand that normally with a mail survey, you get response rates in the 30% range. Ours was much higher. The university was very happy with this response rate. I like to think it indicates a lot of interest in the subject matter. Results of our public survey, I think, indicate pretty strong support across the board. Overall, among landowners, if we ask them, would you like to see elk back in 1 or more of those 3 study areas, 80% of the landowners supported it. If you ask them, how about elk in your own backyard, that support drops a little bit, but it's still very high. It did vary a bit between the Cloquet Valley study area, Fond du Lac, and Nemadji. Lowest in the Fond du Lac area, highest in the Cloquet Valley State Forest. Among local residents, I think equivalent levels of support, 81% overall, ranging from 75% in support in Carlton County up to 83% support among local residents in Southern St. Louis County. We asked landowners about their land uses, and so lumping the 3 study areas together, if a landowner used their land primarily for hunting, 81% of those landowners were in favor of elk restoration. If they were not hunters, did not use their land for hunting, it was still strong, 75%, but a little less. Landowners where timber production was an important use, 76% supported. If they were not interested in timber harvest, 81% support. The bottom, agriculture, I thought was a pretty interesting result. I was expecting, if there's going to be non-support for elk or people against the idea, it would come from the agricultural sector. But among landowners who reported using some or all of their land for agriculture, we still had 73% for elk among those, that segment. And then people who didn't use land for agriculture, much higher at 82%. So we asked landowners and local residents what would be important objectives for you from an elk restoration. So listed in order from most to least important, the number 1 was to minimize impact of elk restoration to existing wildlife populations. I take that to translate as don't screw up what we already have. So I think that's an important thing to take to mind if we go forward with this. Restoration of a native species was number 2 in importance. People like the idea of restoring a native species. Number 3, I think closely related to number 1, if we're going to go forward with elk restoration, minimize impacts to deer population and deer hunting. Number 4 was interesting. Landowners and local residents are not interested in, say, 10, 20, 30 elk out there. They want us to go big, put as many elk on the landscape as the landscape will support. Number 5 was to minimize damage to agriculture and personal property. 6, provide elk hunting opportunities. 7, minimize costs of government elk management activities. With apologies to all my forester friends out there, minimizing damage to trees and forest vegetation ranked 8 in importance on people's list. Number 9, maximize economic opportunities through elk-related tourism and recreation. And number 10, provide elk viewing opportunities. Second part of our feasibility study was assessing habitat suitability. Again, it was led by the university. We did surveys of forage availability. 2017, we did those on public land, state, federal, county, and tribal. 2018 were private land surveys of forage availability. We also looked at things like land use patterns, vegetation cover types, public versus private ownerships, location of captive cervid operations, agriculture, major highway corridors, things like that. We also employed an elk habitat model that was developed in Wisconsin for their clam lake herd as part of our assessment. So we looked at the results many different ways. You could see it all in the full habitat report. I'm just going to throw out 3 of the ones I think are key. One thing was looking at the proportion of public land. As you can see in all 3 of the study areas we looked at, public land is the dominant ownership. I think it ranged from about 2/3 in the Fond du Lac to 70 or 80% or more in the Cloquet Valley and the Namadgi study areas. So lots of public land in all 3 of the study areas we looked at. We tried to come up with a measure of conflict risk, and our risk was a combination of things such as transportation corridors, major highways, agriculture, captive cervid operations, urban areas, things like that, kind of all melded together to prevent a risk to elk and elk restoration, or not so much a risk to elk, but as a potential for conflict. So as you can see in the north, mostly white in the Cloquet Valley. So by our assessment, little or no risk of conflict between elk and people. A little more here in the Fond du Lac area. Here in the north, for example, that's Highway 2 running through there, and there's some farms on either side of the highway, so that certainly presents some risk for conflict there. And then down here in the Namadgi, some risk within the Namadgi study area. Outside of the Namadgi area, there's considerably more risk. And so I think that's important looking ahead into the future. Obviously, none of these areas are fenced. If an elk population were to grow and expand out of these areas, in the Cloquet Valley, they could go in several directions with little or no chance of presenting conflicts. In the Fond du Lac area, if they headed south, they would start running into conflicts, these green areas. In the Namadgi study area, pretty much any direction they go in Minnesota, once they leave that Namadgi study area, they're going to start, there's increased risk of conflicts between elk and people. So this is where we employed that Wisconsin habitat model, looking at forage, cover, a number of different things, indicating that from an elk standpoint, we have lots of suitable habitat in all of the 3 study areas that we looked at for elk. If we try and come up with an estimate of carrying capacity, looking at winter as kind of the limiting season for elk, our model estimates would suggest that we could have 550 or so elk in the Cloquet Valley, 280 or so in the Fond du Lac State Forest, and 480 or so in our Namadgi study area. These are biological carrying capacity estimates. Certainly social carrying capacity might be different than biological carrying capacity. In other words, you know, what the land will support and what people will put up with might be 2 different things. So conclusions from our feasibility studies. There is strong landowner and local resident support for the idea of restoring elk. People think that restoration of a native species is very important. However, if we go ahead and do it, they want to minimize impacts to existing wildlife populations. I think we can accomplish that. We found suitable habitat for elk in all 3 of our study areas. And by our calculations, looking across at Wisconsin and Michigan, we could probably someday have elk densities similar to those states at roughly 1 elk per square mile. So these feasibility studies were only the first steps in what I think has to be and would be a long process. And we've only taken the first steps. I think what has to happen next is getting a green light from political and agency leaderships. Look at the results of our feasibility study, consider what's in front of us, and make a decision whether or not to go forward. The Fond du Lac Reservation Business Committee, after reviewing the results of the feasibility studies and consulting with our natural resource advisory committees and our resource management division, has recently given the green light to the resource management division to proceed with this idea of elk restoration. About a week or 2 ago, we sent a letter to the Minnesota DNR inviting them to participate with the band in this endeavor. At the same time, St. Louis County has thrown up a red light. The Board of Commissioners voted last fall to ask the band, the DNR, the university to not consider the Cloquet Valley State Forest for potential for elk restoration. There are a number of steps that have to be taken going forward. It's my short list. There's probably other steps I'm missing, but I think among them, one of them has to be writing a management plan for elk in eastern Minnesota. Currently, the state has a plan for elk in the Northwest. We don't have a plan for elk in the East. I think this would be a extensive process involving a lot of general public, as well as input from different agencies and interest groups into where we want elk and how we would manage them once they're here, what kind of numbers people want to see, things like that. One of the next steps we have to take is finding a source herd. That's not as easily done as it used to be. I'll talk a little more about that in a second. Possibly Northwest Minnesota is our best hope for a source herd for elk in the East. Chronic wasting disease, in my view, I think is the biggest hurdle to overcome for this restoration effort. There are other diseases that have to be considered, tuberculosis, brucellosis. I'm fairly confident those diseases can be mitigated, but chronic wasting disease is a tough nut to crack. There is as yet no good, widely accepted test for chronic wasting disease for live animals. You can test dead animals, but that certainly doesn't help a restoration effort. Elk, like any other member of the deer family, can get chronic wasting disease. They perhaps get it at a lower rate than white-tailed deer, but they can still get it, and if they get it, they're going to die from it. So that's a tough nut to crack. The best we can do now in the absence of a live animal test is to be very confident that wherever we're bringing elk from, that chronic wasting disease does not exist on the landscape out there. And that comes through testing enough dead deer and elk to be confident that chronic wasting disease isn't there. Raising funds, this would not be an inexpensive endeavor, but I'm pretty confident that the funding can be raised. Elk are a pretty charismatic animal. I think the funding, I think, would come. There would be a lengthy process if we did this to catch animals. They'd need to be quarantined for disease checks before they could be moved, before they could be released. Then of course, once they're released, I believe there should be an extensive follow-up to see where they go and what happens to them and how successful the effort is, certainly before any additional elk would be moved. And so I'm telling people, be patient. A lot of folks say, when are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? I think there's a lot of boxes still to be checked. And even the process of actually moving elk would be a slow one. And I think it should be. We need to do this carefully. So what are the future benefits of a successful elk restoration? I wouldn't mind seeing a sign like this on a barn outside of Cloquet, Minnesota someday. Restoration of a native species. A lot of people feel this is a good thing to do and we should do it where and when we can. Adapting to climate change. Elk are going to be able to adapt to a changing climate. It's going to happen in some form. Not all of our northern wildlife species are going to be able to adapt. I think forestry is ahead of wildlife in many places, you know, considering planting seedlings in places north of their historic range. And I think we need to start thinking about and doing things like that with our wildlife populations as well, because they're not all going to be able to get here under their own power. I think elk are very compatible with forest management and other kinds of wildlife management, and could even be a vehicle for funding to accomplish forest management, wildlife management. If, for example, you're wanting to provide or manage a forest for young aspen, well, that's providing elk habitat. And I think different kinds of elk habitat management could benefit anything from monarch butterflies to woodcock to turkeys and white-tailed deer. There's an economic boost to be had from elk tourism. I think most states with healthy elk populations recognize this and take advantage of it. Duluth is certainly well situated for tourism. It's already a major tourism market. And I think having elk out on the landscape is something that would draw people out of the city and out into the woods driving around looking for elk. And eventually elk hunting. Certainly the Fond du Lac Band has a strong culture of hunting. It's important to the band, and from the band standpoint, they're in this to someday have a large enough elk population to allow for sustainable elk hunting. So that's what I had, if there's questions.
Great, thank you, Mike, for a good presentation. I've had several questions come in through the chat pod. Those of you who are watching, that is the way to enter questions. Someone also used the Q&A pod, which is just fine. Either one of those will work. So let's go through a couple of these. Mike, although elk are said to be relatively insensitive to climate change, the study zone's existing flora and wildlife are likely to be affected by it. Did the habitat suitability study consider those anticipated changes?
No, we didn't consider the anticipated changes. Other than that, I'm pretty confident based on elk's adaptability that whatever changes occur in the vegetation is elk will find something to eat when it changes.
Okay, is there any research that shows if elk are more or less susceptible to CWD compared to white-tailed deer?
So I'm maybe not the best source to ask about that. There's certainly more knowledgeable people, but I'm given to understand that as the work that's been done would indicate that elk are less susceptible to chronic wasting disease than white-tailed deer are.
Okay. We had one over here. Do elk prefer white pine, oak, or birch regeneration for browse, similar to the way deer damage regeneration of those tree species?
So I think they are certainly going to feast on some of our northern hardwood species like oak, and similar to how we have to protect them now in many cases against white-tailed deer browse. We may have to build those fences a little taller or keep them in place a little longer to protect against elk browse. As far as white pine, I've asked that question a number of times of Wisconsin and Michigan elk biologists, and they all kind of shrug their shoulders. In fact, in Michigan, what has happened in places is elk will camp out on a 40-acre aspen clear cut, and nothing moves them off of that clear cut. If they're allowed to stay there and browse, they wind up converting that aspen stand to a white pine stand. And they're not interested in the white pine. I thought that was a pretty neat trick, and I think we should try that here in Carlton or southern St. Louis County, because we seem to have the opposite problem. So no, as far as browsing on conifers, cedars as well, doesn't seem to be much of an issue with elk. Certainly they will browse aspen, they will browse it hard. Michigan's elk range does not have wolves. Our elk range, if we put elk here, is well stocked with wolves. I don't think a herd of cow, elk, and calves are going to be allowed to camp out in an area very long before the local wolf pack moves them to a different area. But they will browse aspen hard, but aspen's very tolerant of heavy browsing pressure. And I think in most cases, elk browse will simply replace the natural mortality that occurs anyways in a young aspen stand. Michigan is not reporting any impact on their aspen production because of elk.
Any questions here locally?
Yeah, what do you, I mean, how they've had their populations for how long again, Mike?
Michigan, question was how long have Michigan, I assume Wisconsin?
Yeah, so the question then gets to what's the longer term impact? So it's only been 10 years.
Well, Wisconsin put elk in the Clam Lake area in 1995. So we're what, north of 30 years there.
No,
20, sorry, that's my higher math skills. Michigan restored elk in 1918. And so they've had elk for over 100 years now. And I think a lot of familiarity with how elk do and don't impact the landscape.
So in areas that do have elk and areas that don't have elk, what would you say how do they impact the longer term species mix or the plant community mix?
I don't know. You know, I think if you compare elk and deer densities on the landscape and their ability to drive vegetation communities, you know, these other Midwestern states are looking at elk densities of 1 per square mile across the landscape. Certainly there'll be areas where it's a little bit higher. Elk are a herd animal. You know, that kind of density is similar to our decent moose habitat in Northeast Minnesota, 1 animal per square mile. So yes, elk are a little bigger than deer. I don't really see them driving our vegetation community. I think that is still going to be driven by white-tailed deer, which depending on where you are is, you know, 10, 15, 20 deer per square mile.
We've got a couple of other questions online. What was the main objection against elk from St. Louis County?
St. Louis County had several objections that they listed in their resolution. One was the risk of vehicle collisions. The other was risk of spreading diseases. Tuberculosis was mentioned, and also chronic wasting disease.
Did they look at the data?
The question in the back was, did they look at the data? I'm in front of an open mic. I would prefer not to answer that question. Ask me after 5 o'clock.
Next question, are there ideas to deal with depredation and encouraging folks protecting their resources before getting reimbursed for losses?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we have a lot of experience now in Northwest Minnesota in protecting resources against elk damage. I think the first requirement is you have to have a producer that is willing to take those steps. Fence damage is very hard to protect against. Stored forage, if the producer is willing to take the steps, is very easy to protect. You put it in a building or you build a fence around it. And the state has resources to help do that. And I think to our benefit here in the Northeast is we don't have large acres planted to corn and soybean and sunflowers and other things that elk might like. So I, for the most part, I think that's a non-issue. Yes, there are resources and ways to prevent damage from happening in the first place.
What can we do to encourage the DNR to help the Fond du Lac Reservation restore elk?
Write the commissioner of the DNR a nice letter and express your strong support for the idea. And copy your legislator while you're at it.
All right, I am just checking my chat pod here. I don't think I have any other questions online. Any other questions here?
Yeah, so you showed the ranking of the objective, the potential objectives, and I'm wondering what the numbers are next to those rankings, because rankings, it could mean that everybody supported one and didn't support. I'm wondering what the numbers are.
Right. So I earlier in my presentation, I listed the objectives that landowners and local residents felt were important for any elk restoration. I did not list numbers. There are numbers associated with that. It's in our full report. In the interest of not cluttering up my PowerPoint screen, I didn't do that. I just listed them highest to lowest.
Do you recall how the numbers were kind of spread? Was it like 1 through 4 were similar in percentage of support?
No, I don't recall that. Sorry. The question was if I recalled how how the spread was on those objectives, if some were more closely related in importance to others. That information is in the complete report, which is available from me. It's available through the Legislative Commission on Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources. Or other, we have a website and a Facebook page as well. If you don't already have a copy, a lot more details and numbers are available in those reports.
Mike, you've mentioned that reintroductions are not likely to succeed if there's not a high level of public support in the vicinity. But what are the other factors determining success? You mentioned that Ontario had some successful, some not. You mentioned the same thing with some of the other reintroductions. Can you speak to that at all?
So I think a lot of the earlier successful elk reintroductions, what was necessary there was, so in those landscapes, predators were gone. Bears and wolves, so predation was not much of an issue. The biggest predator, if you will, was poaching, so in many cases it was the state agencies putting an effort into getting local support and cracking down on illegal harvest of elk, and that made a big difference in earlier years.
Great. Any other questions here? All right, I'm not seeing any questions online either, so I will, at this point, thank everyone for joining us for Mike's presentation this afternoon. Mike, thank you for your time. This is a really nice update, and I appreciate your sharing your information in this way. We have been recording this. I've been recording the presentation, and I will make the recording available online shortly. I want to apologize again for the link problem. I think I must have sent the wrong link out earlier. So to those of you who missed the first couple minutes because of that, I am sorry about that. If you're interested in continuing education credits, I have shared the link a couple of times in the chat pod. Sometimes when you close your meeting window, it'll take you to that form, but this time it will not because I didn't set that up and I can't edit the meeting while the meeting is ongoing. So again, my mistake on that, but look to the chat pod. If you have any trouble with that, you can email me, esagor@umn.edu, and I can get that going for you. But do go ahead and just add your name and email address to that CEU request form online. Thanks again, Mike, and everyone else for joining us, and I hope we'll see you again next month. Bye for now.